cost of the state's education system is a leading issue for Vermonters this election. It's also notoriously complicated, as Senate Minority Leader Randy Brock pointed out during a spirited debate back in February.
Right now, we have a tax system as far as education funding. I defy you, any one of you, to truly explain it to the voters in the town meeting day.
With education funding top of mind for voters, Vermont Public's Lola Duffort breaks down how it all works. Plus, the author of a landmark Vermont hospital report admits errors in the report, but stands by the report's conclusions that the state's healthcare system needs a major overhaul as hospitals and state regulators grapple with how to rein in costs while also providing quality care. That and more ahead on Vermont This Week.
From the Vermont Public Studio in Winooski, this is Vermont This Week. Made possible in part by the Lintelak Foundation and Milne Travel. Here's moderator Mitch Wertlieb.
Thanks for being with us. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. It's Friday, October 25th. And joining us on the panel today, we have Mark Johnson from WCAX, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, and joining us remotely today, Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Thank you all so much for being here today. We're going to start with something very different today. You heard me talk at the top about how complicated our education funding system is here in Vermont. Well, we've got a very special video to show you, and it's going to do it in a way that you may not be used to, but it's going to explain some things about the education system, and I think you'll find it fascinating. Here it is.
Have you ever wondered how Vermont schools get funded and how your property taxes get calculated? You're not alone. It's pretty confusing. So we're here to break it down. First, local school boards create a budget for their district. And on town meeting day, residents either vote to approve or reject this budget. Once a voter-approved spending plan is in place, the school board sends the state a bill for basically the full amount. Now, the state must pay for all of these budgets, plus a few related expenses. And so in total this year, Vermont will spend $2.3 billion on education. But Vermont doesn't just use property taxes to pay for schools. We also have sales taxes, the lottery, and other sources feeding into the statewide education fund. In Montpelier, state lawmakers check how well these sources are doing, and then figure out how much they'll need to raise from property taxes to make up the difference. There are two types of school taxes: homestead property taxes, which are applied to primary residences, and non-homestead property taxes, which are applied to basically all other types of property, including commercial buildings, rental properties, and second homes. Now, the non-homestead rate is fairly simple. Technically, the legislature sets one statewide non-homestead rate. But to ensure fairness, we use a common level of appraisal, or CLA, to adjust the tax rate in each town. So each town's taxes reflect current and fair market values. Every town appraises its properties a little differently and on different timelines. So this helps make sure that towns with outdated appraisals aren't inadvertently getting their residents an unfair discount. So the tax department takes that one homestead rate that the legislature sets and then uses the CLA to adjust the rate from town to town. Homestead taxes, unfortunately, are trickier. Each school district gets a rate depending on their spending per student. Districts with lower spending per pupil have proportionally lower tax rates. Each district's homestead rate, which is pegged to that spending per pupil, is then adjusted again using each town's CLA. That is why homestead rates look different from town to town, even when those towns are in the same school district. The difference between tax rates before and after the CLA is applied can be jarring, so updates, which will be in effect in 2025, aim to bake in some of this adjustment earlier in the process so that people are less surprised when final rates come out. Now, we should note that this per pupil calculation that I mentioned earlier isn't straightforward. Some kids should cost more to educate, like students in rural settings or those living in poverty. So they're weighted differently when the state is figuring out how much a district is spending per pupil. Act 127, that new law you may have been hearing about, adjusted these weights. Plus, Vermont income sensitizes property taxes, meaning if your household earns below a certain amount, you get a tax credit. And roughly 2/3 of Vermonters receive such a credit. So how does this usually all come together in Montpelier? Well, unless lawmakers want to change the basic structure of the system, they typically have really two choices to make. First, they have to decide how much of the burden to put on the homestead tax versus non-homestead. And then, if they're lucky and the education fund has a surplus, they have to decide what to do with that extra cash. A surplus, however, can be a double-edged sword. One-time money is best spent on one-time expenses, but it's pretty tempting politically to use a surplus to take the pressure off property taxes. The problem with that, of course, is that education spending is an ongoing expense. And so when a surplus or any other type of one-time money is used to artificially buy down rates in one year, that means tax rates will have to play catch-up the following year. You risk a spike. Yes, it's super complicated. So why do we have a system that is so mind-numbingly complex? Why can't we make it simpler? Well, that's because fundamentally it's designed to be fair while preserving local control. 30 years ago, we had a very different system. While the state did provide some funding, school budgets were generally a local affair. School boards and local voters decided how much they wanted to spend, and then they set tax rates based on their local grand list to raise that money. There was one big problem with that system. Property-rich towns could spend lavishly on their schools, even with low tax rates, while property-poor towns struggled to pay for the basics, even with high tax rates. It wasn't fair. There was a lawsuit about it, and in 1997, the Vermont Supreme Court decided that the status quo was unconstitutional. In response, the legislature passed Act 60, and that is why we rely on a statewide education fund and not local grand lists to pay for schools. The basic notion of the law is this: whether you live in Bennington or Barrie, if your school is spending the same per pupil, your tax rate will be the same. Our education system is often hailed as one of the most progressive in the country, but it's not without its problems. One, it's incredibly complex, which means that it's difficult for voters to understand the implications of their vote when they're asked to weigh in on school budgets. Two, it's not cheap, and in an era of declining enrollment, some want to see more cost containment, although others argue that tax reform is the answer. And three, while it uses a lot of incentives to try and encourage the highest need districts to spend more and more privileged districts to spend a little less, local voters and school boards still get the final say on spending. And sometimes, more privileged communities still choose to spend more, while poorer communities still choose to spend less. So the challenge before us is this. Can we make the system more affordable? Can we make things more fair? Can we make things more legible to people on the ground? And can we do all of this while preserving local control?
Well, Lola, can we? This is the real-life Lola Duffort. That was the animated version of Lola giving us that explainer video. Fascinating. I want to very quickly say this took a lot to put together. That 7 minutes that you saw might have looked simple, but Lola Duffort did a ton of work on this. April McCallum, Mike Dunn, Kyle Ambusk, Kaylee Mumford, and Brian Stevenson all helped put that video together. And thank you for doing that. You know, it does explain a lot. It's the kind of thing you have to go back maybe and watch a few times, though, again, because this is incredibly complex. But what I found fascinating about it was that, you know, this was not the way it was done originally. Back in the late 90s, this changed. And is the change, can we at least say this, is the change a little bit for the better as far as fairness goes?
I'd say yes. I mean, I think, you know, and if you talk to folks in Montpelier, as much as people want to change the status quo, most people agree, on all sides of the aisle, that we should not go back to, a pre-Act 60 world, a pre-Brigham world, where it was basically every town for itself. And so there is, at least that common ground.
But one of the things I found interesting about this is that the property taxes are still, an issue for so many Vermonters, and so many folks saw sticker shock this year. It got brought down a little bit. I guess it could have been about an 18% increase this year, brought down to about 14%. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
And that was a political calculation. I mean, was that money paid down because there was just no way you could pass that on to Vermonters and say, this is what you got to pay?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things I kind of talk about in the video. I don't reference specifically what just happened, but the reason that tax rates went from, projected 20-ish% to about 14% is in part because lawmakers bought them down again. They used about $70 million to bring that down, which was, something that their constituents were saying very loudly that they needed them to do. But that decision is going to be one that we contend with this upcoming year. And, school officials and lawmakers themselves have admitted that this was kind of a Faustian bargain that they had to make. The governor who had proposed an alternative also wanted to use one-time money, but he wanted to use one-time money that was in reserves, which would have needed to be paid back, right? And so very likely would have made things worse, at least, this next year.
Mark Johnson, you've been looking at this issue too, yeah?
There's no question that this is fairer and better than pre-Brigham. I mean, as you said, really it was every town for themselves, and you had very wealthy communities that had a relatively small number of kids, and people's property taxes were pretty low. I mean, we talked about gold towns in the past. I think one of the issues that people have with the current system, though, is that what you spend in your community is not directly connected with what you pay in taxes. Mm-hmm. It all kind of goes into this large pool and then is divvied back. So, we saw communities, a third of the communities out there turning down their school budgets. And even if they turned them down, there wasn't that connection between what you were voting on and what your taxes were going to be. So there's got to be somewhere in between there.
And a lot of those school budgets voted down multiple times. Howard Weiss-Tisman, you've been seeing this in southern Vermont too, right? I mean, you got a lot of questions from folks in Putney, I believe, about their property taxes.
Right. So the Putney tax bills shot up, astronomically this year. And something that we haven't touched on, there are just so many things that go into this. Insurance premiums are huge. A lot of the past year, we're coming out of COVID, where there was a lot of COVID money that schools had to spend. So it was just a really tough year in towns all over Vermont. As you said, the tax rate this year was just very high. And I don't see too much on the horizon that's we're not going to be back here talking about this again, in a couple of months.
Well, this study came out recently, and Lola, I know that you took a look at this, arguing that Vermont could cut or save some $400 million in school spending if they change the system, change the way everything works. And I remember the story that you wrote about this. There was a reaction from Don Tinney, the head of Vermont's NEA, the Education Association, and he had one word for it: absurd.
Yeah, it was a pretty strong reaction. And, to be, the study that came out, which was commissioned by lawmakers, was very much a theoretical exercise, right? There is no world in which lawmakers can flip a switch and save $400 million next year. And while there are, say, a lot of parallels between the conversation going on between, in healthcare and in education, right? In healthcare, we recently got a report that was like, you need to do this, X, Y, Z. Right. That roadmap does not yet exist for our schools, right?
So what was this report saying then? The theoretical part of it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the theoretical part of it was like, you have X number of students. based on best practices. Like you could spend, based on this body of literature, you could spend this amount of money and be reasonably certain that you would be delivering an education that was just as good, if not better, than what you are doing now. But, and this is big but, you would have larger classes and you would have larger schools, right? This study did not go into like, this is, you could do it this way and, no kid would have a bus ride of, it didn't deal with the particulars.
Short on details, it sounds like.
Yeah, which it was never sort of the intent of this, right? The intent of it was just to try and figure out like, okay, what is actually like a sort of theoretical reasonable amount of money to spend on schools? It's sort of like a first data point. Because a whole bunch of stakeholders are meeting and trying to figure out what that roadmap should look like, right?
Yeah.
And so, it's a really interesting report. I think, as Phil Scott has said, like we have commissioned a lot of studies over the years. And they all sort of boil down to the same conclusions, which is that, the current way we deliver education in Vermont is expensive in large part because we have really small schools, really, really small classes, and the smallest staff to student ratios in the country.
Yeah, well, and that's something that's not
I
going to be
think
solved
you're
anytime
exactly right. And the parallel between this discussion and the healthcare discussion, I mean, we've got 250 schools, we have 14 hospitals, but we're a very rural state. And I think that the same theme that's running through these is that people don't want to be too far from a hospital, they don't want to be too far from a school. And at the same time, we're trying to attract younger people to come to Vermont. And I think both of those situations are a negative for people to want to live out in the boonies, so to speak. So, it sounds good on paper, but when you really boil it down, unless you're living in Chittenden County or down near Dartmouth in the healthcare discussion, you're going to be pretty far away from a major facility.
Well, Mark, you've been digging into this healthcare report. Outside consultant came in to talk about this. One thing I want to get out of the way first is that the author of the report actually said he made some errors in the report, but the overall conclusions of the report do not change.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. I mean, yes, there were some miscalculations, but I think the bottom line and the most alarming part of this report is that out of the 14 hospitals we have, if we go at the rate we're continuing to go right now, by 2028, 13 of the 14 hospitals are going to be losing major money, and the accumulated deficit between now and then he pegs between $2 and $3 billion. So I think the point of that report was that we better make some adjustments now before hospitals start closing, and let's figure out an appropriate role for them, and what's the appropriate number to have major medical care facilities, and what do we do with the rest of them? For example, have some of them focus on primary care, maybe have one specialize in orthopedic surgery, and not have all hospitals trying to do all things at the same time.
Were those the specific or some of the specific recommendations they made in that report?
Well, the report kind of just gave a roadmap, and then, it's going to be up to the Green Mountain Care Board and really the Agency of Human Services to then take that, digest it. I think that's where the report was leading them to.
There's some specific examples, Howard, that you've been looking at in southern Vermont. You mentioned that there's a Bellows Falls clinic, I believe, that's going to close because it's unsustainable financially. What can you tell us about that?
Right. So the Bellows Falls clinic is a little bit separate. This report specifically looked at hospitals and our hospital system. The clinic is part of a larger healthcare group that works out of Springfield. So it's kind of the same thing, but a little bit different. But there's so much to talk about here. And Mark touched on the similarities with the school discussion. The hospitals across the state have been pushing back really hard on this report. I was at a community meeting last night in Townsend for the Grace Cottage group. And what strikes me with the school discussion, it's like in the big talk, everyone is upset about their property tax bills going up. Everyone is upset about their insurance rates going up. But when it gets down to closing your hospital or your school, that's where no one wants to make the tough choices. And that's what Grace Cottage Hospital is the smallest hospital in the state. And when you're at this public meeting and a woman stands up and says she broke 27 bones in a bicycle accident and Grace Cottage helped her nurse herself back to health, it's really strong arguments. It's the same thing in the school. All across the state, we can say we want to close small schools, but then families stand up and they say we're losing the soul of our community and we can't attract more families. So it's a really tough conversation. It's a really tough challenge. What the hospital report is pointing out and what the school, the report Lola talked about, is that we just have to make some really tough decisions. It's not going to be easy. There's no silver bullet. There are not too many ways to make education or healthcare cheaper. And there are some really tough choices. I'll just say very quickly, what we're seeing here is it feels like this is all coming to a head. The tax rate last year was so eye-popping. Our insurance rates, Lola did some reporting this week. Healthcare rates are going up again for schools. So, if last year was tough, next year is going to be even harder. And it's just going to take some really tough decisions to try to move this conversation forward.
Another thing I'll say is I've been really struck as I've been covering these school closure discussions where often, right, you do get those parents standing up saying, please don't close my school. I love this school. I love this small atmosphere. But I'm also meeting a lot of parents who are saying, actually, I want more for my kid. And I believe that a larger facility could deliver that. And I think that what I'm seeing is that for a lot of people, like whether or not you can save money doesn't really feel like a convincing argument to get rid of these institutions or to change them. But the only one that does is when you actually can say, like, here are the things we can do better, right, for you in terms of, like, can we deliver you better medical care? Can we offer your child more programming? And I have found that really interesting, right, is that for so many people, the actual decision of whether or not to change or to close does not seem to be really a financial calculation, but about that thing that you get from this institution.
Right. Yeah, what can you get from
fair
it?
Because, when these class sizes are 10, 12 kids, there's a much richer experience, many people feel, if they can be in a larger classroom and have more interaction with other kids. And I think what it really comes down to, in some cases, is how long a bus ride are you willing to let your kid and you put up with?
And hasn't that been Governor Phil Scott's argument too? That, we have to consolidate, we have to get rid of these very small classroom sizes. That's been his argument.
And let me just jump in here.
Yeah, please.
This also, there's a parallel with the healthcare in that the report says the same thing, is that we're trying to save money, but we're also trying to improve healthcare for everybody. Because if you're going to a hospital that's only doing 6 or 8 or a dozen operations in a year, studies have shown outcomes are better when doctors are doing more of these procedures, and the healthcare will improve if we can get over this mountain that's ahead of us.
Yeah, but the numbers do keep getting in the way, Lola. I mean, you say the health insurance premiums for schools are set to rise nearly 12%?
Nearly 12%. And it was funny, when I was talking to folks at VHI, the Vermont Education Health Initiative, they manage the tax rates. They were joking when they said this, but they were like, we actually received quite a few people saying, oh, we thought it'd be worse.
Okay.
And to be clear, they weren't like proud, like only 12%. They fully understand that is too high. But the point is we now expect the trend lines to get just, they're so bad that, you get hit with a 12% and you're like, well, it could have been worse. And that's sort of where we are right now. And it kind of feels like we're at the toughest part.
Last couple of minutes here, we can get off schools and hospitals for a moment. I want to mention a political story that maybe caught the panel here by surprise, caught me by surprise. House Speaker Jill Krowinski now facing a challenge from Dover Independent Laura Sibilia, who wrote to her colleagues and said she wants the position, and she said this is not a stunt. Were you all surprised by that?
I was somewhat. Given how strong the Democratic majority is right now, you would think Jill Krowinski was, no one was going to bother to challenge her. I think really Laura Sibilia's got quite a task ahead of her here. I mean, she would literally have to get every Republican and get a big chunk of the Democrats to go along with her. I mean, one thing that I think the news stories that talk about this should point out, it is a secret ballot. So if you were going to be doing it publicly, there's no chance. But, you know, unless there's, and I know there's been some pushback on Jill Krowinski's leadership, but, you know, to the extent to which she's going to get ousted from this, I'd say long shot.
Long shot, you think?
Yeah, I think definitely a long shot, but I do think it speaks to some pretty interesting dynamics in the House. The strength of the rural caucus, right, which Laura Sibilia is a really key member of, and which is a bipartisan caucus, and fractures in particular around housing, right, and the role that housing and conservation are playing. And so, you know, I don't think she'll win, but I do think it speaks to real fissures.
We'll see if that happens, and we'll check it out next week as well. I'm Mitch Wertlieb. I want to thank our panelists, Mark Johnson from WCAX, Lola Duffort from Vermont Public, and Howard Weiss-Tisman from Vermont Public. Hope you can join us again next week on Vermont This Week.